The 16th Amendment was sort of our undoing. The states used to be responsible for the federal debt. The states used to have to come up with the taxes before you had direct taxation of people. The federal government now just reaches right past the states and takes the money from the people. And that is what has allowed this crazy amount of spending. And then the Federal Reserve is the thing that facilitates this deficit spending.
This is Christian Gomez with the New American Magazine. Today we're pleased to have on Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky to discuss spending, unconstitutional foreign aid to Ukraine, January 6th, the new church committee that he will be on, his thoughts on amending the U.S. Constitution and the Federal Reserve System. Congressman Massie, thank you so much for joining us today here in the program.
Thanks for having me on, Christian.
So about a month ago, or over a month ago on Christmas Eve, Congress passed a massive $1.6 to $1.7 trillion spending bill. That was the last major spending bill that was passed under Nancy Pelosi's speakership and the Democrats controlling both of the legislative chambers. And you and 199 other Republicans voted against that monstrosity of an omnibus. But now that Republicans control just the House of Representatives, of course, not the Senate and the White House, does this division now mean that we're likely to see government shutdowns in the future? Or are Republicans going to end up acquiescing to Biden and Schumer's spending demands? What's your plan or strategy to prevent another one of these $1.6, $1.7 trillion spending bills from passing again?
Well, first of all, that's legislative malpractice, the $1.7 trillion spending bill, where they put everything together, all 12 appropriations bills stuffed into one, plus extra stuff, like Ukraine spending and a few other extra things in there that don't even belong in a spending bill were in that omnibus bill. And by the way, the spending bills were due September 30th. So there were two CRs and then that spending bill. So the Democrats came to the brink of a shutdown 3 times when they controlled both houses of Congress and the White House. And so there's a lot of hand-wringing now because Republicans have 1/2 of 1/3 of the government in our control, that something like a spending cut might happen. And that's what I would like to see. Now, there are going to be 2 big, I guess there'll be showdowns coming up. One will be raising the debt limit and one will be passing the 12 separate spending bills. As part of the negotiations that were going on when Kevin was elected as Speaker, we got guarantees that we would pass all 12 separate bills, that conservatives would be allowed to offer amendments to cut spending on all 12 of those bills, and that we would force the Senate to take them up. Now, an idea that I have proposed that it seems to be popular within the conference, and it might be consummated here as a consequence of raising the debt limit, it might be part of that deal, is for the House to go ahead and pass a continuing resolution that funds the government at 99% on October 1st. Now, let me unpack that. I've never voted for a continuing resolution myself. I hate them. It's basically like a cut, copy, paste of the last omnibus. But I thought to myself, how could I vote for a CR? Well, if it cut government 1%, which seems to be a pretty modest proposal to me, and it only kicks in if the 12 separate appropriations bills aren't taken up by the Senate and signed by Joe Biden, it's a really good backstop. Because here's what would happen on September 30th, where the next shutdown, let me call it that's going to happen, will be September 30th at midnight if 12 separate appropriations bills aren't passed. CNN, if the House adopts my plan, CNN won't be able to put a countdown clock on the screen that says 24 hours until all of government shuts down. The countdown clock would have to say 24 hours until all discretionary spending takes a 1% haircut. And that way we take shutdown off the table. We are the adults in the room. And the Senate will hopefully be, by the way, Christian, The threat of flat funding here terrifies these people. The threat of using last year's number terrifies them. So the idea that we would have a 1% cut if they fail to act on our 12 bills is extreme motivation, I believe, for the Senate to come to the table. And that's what I would like to see us get maybe on this debt limit increase, is not necessarily a policy change, but again, and I know people aren't excited about this, but I'm super excited after being here 10 years about this. What we need to get is a way in which we negotiate these things when we get to the brink so that we can win instead of losing.
So is the entire Republican conference behind this strategy of yours? Have they embraced it fully? Or is that still being worked on?
I rolled this out in November and December, and I've brought it up again here recently. Jim Jordan's a big fan of it and promotes it in the meetings that I'm not in because he is chairman. But and Kevin McCarthy seems to be a fan of it. Now, when you say is the whole conference behind it, I presume you mean are there 218 behind it, which is almost the same thing as the whole conference, since we have 222 in the majority. There is broad support. I would say 90+%, support it. Can I guarantee there aren't 5 who would oppose it? In this majority, there's no way you could guarantee that. I think, I'd like to find out. I'd like to put it to a vote. I think there's a good chance they would support it.
What did Kevin McCarthy think about this plan when you proposed it to him?
He was a big fan of it in December, even before it got written down in the negotiations. By the way, this is part of the negotiations that happened 2 weeks ago, was that we would do something like this. And, there's in the 15 rounds of voting, it was hard to get really specific because not everybody was at the table to agree to the sort of things that compelled the 20 and a half members to eventually let Kevin McCarthy be Speaker, some by voting present, some by voting for Kevin. But as we hammer out those details, Kevin seems to be a fan of it. And I think he's got to be a fan of things that unite the conference and help us win the messaging war. Because some of the biggest fans of my plan are the members who are from the purple districts, or the districts that Joe Biden won by 4 points, because they need to have a credible plan that that doesn't cause them to get unelected in their general election, but also shows the conservatives who are going to pick who wins the primary that they are also fighting for fiscal responsibility. And by the way, Christian, this is basically the penny plan, okay? That's what this is, but reduced to practice and only as a backstop. Only as a backstop if we can't get the 12 separate bills taken up by the Senate and signed by Joe Biden. The penny plan kicks in, and it doesn't touch Social Security or Medicare. It's so modest that I'm almost ashamed to tell you it was my idea.
Speaking of the $1.6, $1.7 trillion spending bill that was passed, you mentioned that it had funding for Ukraine. Almost $47 billion in aid went to Ukraine in just that one omnibus. So at this point, we've sent at least over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine. Is the new House majority interested in providing any precise clarity as to where this money is exactly going in Ukraine, what it's being used for?
Well, I think we should have an inspector general, auditing every penny. And by audit, I mean, you don't just look at the books. You go inspect the equipment. If we've paid for something, you go take inventory. This is what a real audit means. Now, I wouldn't have voted to send a penny there. And so that position might seem radical to some here in Washington, D.C. It actually seems to be the norm in northern Kentucky for the 750,000 people I represent. But I think, regardless of whether you think the money should have gone there or not, I believe most people understand that the only right thing to do once it's there, or once it's been voted on to go there, is to make sure that it's going where you intended for it to go. We had such a office in Afghanistan to monitor the roughly $50 billion a year that went there. Now we're talking about twice as much money per year going to Ukraine. And if we had an inspector general in Afghanistan, we need one in Ukraine.
Of course, and sadly, a lot of what we sent in terms of military equipment into Afghanistan is now in the hands of the Taliban. So we certainly wouldn't want, whether you're for aid or against aid, we wouldn't want any equipment that we do send to get into the hands of the Russians. And speaking of equipment being sent, what is your opinion about the U.S. sending M1 Abrams tanks and Germany sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine? Do you see that as an escalation to the conflict over there?
It's not a good development. I don't think we should be doing it. If they wanted to buy them, I suppose we could sell them to them. But for us to provide them is bad. And, some people would argue there's a distinction between providing defensive weapons and offensive weapons. Obviously, tanks could be used in an offensive. I mean, that's the way Russia has used their tanks. So these are weapons that can be used in an offensive manner. And if, they went into Russian territory using tanks that we gave them, if there was any doubt before that we're co-combatants, there would be no doubt at that point, I think. And I think it's a dangerous position to be in, to be co-combatants with somebody who's fighting a nuclear power. I think it's somewhat ridiculous for us to hem ourselves in and to say that our only conditions for dropping our support is if Putin is overthrown or takes a bullet to the head. And while we're sending Abrams tanks in, it's a terrible position for America to take. I think we should be trying to encourage some kind of negotiated settlement there.
Of course, and heeding the advice of the founders to steer clear from foreign entanglements as well. Last year, we saw the Democrats run a very highly partisan committee, the January 6th committee, and J6 has become something of a Rorschach test, if you will, where the left believes it was this failed insurrection by conservatives, and conservatives see it kind of as a question mark. So, in your estimation, what transparency in the new House majority? Is the new House majority willing to give the American people on the question of January on the question of January 6th? Specifically, do you think that Kevin McCarthy is willing to release the 14,000 hours of unreleased video footage of what actually happened that day, showing government agents allowing Americans to go in and so forth? What are your thoughts on transparency from the January 6th investigations?
I think we should have total transparency. Release all of those videos. Release a list of not just the people that we know about who were in uniform that were letting the protesters into the Capitol. Release a list of the protesters who were working with the government. Let us know who those people were. Identify them in the videos. And, I've asked Merrick Garland in sworn testimony, he was sworn in, how many agents or assets of the federal government were present on January 5th and January 6th and agitating to go into the Capitol? Just answer that question. He refused to answer the question. So I would be completely transparent about it and let the chips fall where they may.
Absolutely. And speaking of House committees, you'll be serving on the newly created Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, which many Republicans are comparing to the 1975 Church Committee formed by Senate Democrats and led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho back at the time to investigate government intelligence agencies. So, Congressman Massie, do you see this new committee as an opportunity here to do something equaling sort of the informative impact of what the Church and Pike committees unveiled at the time? And if the new committee finds any evidence of government malfeasance, how confident are you that there will be any consequences, especially with Merrick Garland, as you mentioned, being in charge of the Justice Department and the Biden administration still controlling at least the executive branch of government?
Well, a lot to unpack there. It feels like there were 5 questions, and if I don't answer them all, feel free to re-ask them. But the first one that I got out of that was, Is this an opportunity? This is an amazing opportunity. This is one of the biggest opportunities that I've had since in the 10 years that I've been in Congress to uncover not government incompetence, but government malfeasance, particularly with the intent of suppressing the civil liberties of the American people. Let me tell you what I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be a relitigation of the last election. I don't think it should become about any one particular politician. I think this is about the American people. Have their civil liberties, whether it's freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom of speech, right to keep and bear arms, life, liberty, and property, privacy. Have any of those rights been violated by the federal government in a willful manner? And uncovering that. So it's a great opportunity. I hope we don't blow it. Behind the doors here, when this camera turns off, I am in that committee fighting to make sure that it is real, that it's not some kind of show committee. Now, the biggest obstacle we're going to have, obviously, and this is when you'll know whether you'll get an indication of whether it's serious or not, is that the executive branch will try to obfuscate, they will try to delay. We have 2 years to do this, but they will try to tie us up when we issue subpoenas. They'll refuse stuff. They'll say they don't have it. They'll say it's the subject of ongoing investigation, et cetera, all of those things. What we need to tell them is we will cut your funding. Your department will no longer exist on October 1st. Or it'll be, half the size, whatever it takes to compel them to come to the table. Now, another one of your questions in there is, will it lead to changes? Will something actually be done as a result of this? This committee will happen in stages. We have to do investigations. Not all of those will be open to the public. We need to find if there's there. Then bring it out in open hearings. Bring those people who were responsible for it in front of the TV cameras, compel them to answer our questions live on TV so the American people can decide. Ultimately, it's also going to be up to the American people. If the voters aren't upset, if the constituents aren't upset and compelled to tell their congressman to do something about this, then I'm going to just tell you right now, the majority of congressmen up here won't do anything unless they're pressed to do it. So the hearings hopefully will compel the public to pressure Congress to do things. Now, one technical aspect of the organization of this committee is that it's a select committee, but it's a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. There was some debate over whether it should stand on its own, like the January 6th committee did, or would it be hemmed in or constrained as a subcommittee of a standing committee. Let me tell you the benefit of it being a subcommittee of a standing committee. The Judiciary Committee, on which I also serve, has authorization authority for the spending. So I think it's good that the parent committee of the select committee can withhold money from the DOJ and the FBI and ATF. Those are the organizations that we have funding authorization for. So we have an advantage there, but also, to your question, after we uncover things, if we find anything, if there is a legislative fix, it resides within the authorizations for the DOJ or the FBI or the ATF, we are already a subcommittee of the committee that is duly authorized with jurisdiction to oversee and legislate the authorities of the FBI and DOJ. Let me remind your viewers, Congress created the Department of Justice. It's not in the Constitution. It's not a branch in the Constitution. Congress created the FBI. These are creations of Congress. We can uncreate them. We can recreate them. And that authority is in the Judiciary Committee, which is the parent committee of the Select Committee.
Speaking of uncreating things created by Congress, back in December 30th, you tweeted, as part of a series of tweets, you tweeted, quote, repeal of the 3 acts of 1913, referring to the Federal Reserve Act, the 16th and 17th Amendments. So repeal of the three acts of 1913 violent toward our republic would obviate any need or want for a term limit amendment and a balanced budget amendment. The document our founders gave us was genius, and we tamper with it at our own peril. Could you elaborate further on this and why you believe term limits and a balanced budget amendment aren't, why they're not really a good idea?
Well, the founders actually didn't trust the people to elect senators. And the senators were supposed to be representatives of the states. So I think if you're not happy with the elections every year and you think term limits is the answer, well, then go back and look at what happened with the 17th Amendment. Actually, the founders knew better already. So if the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators, hadn't happened, then you wouldn't need term limits or think you need term limits for senators. The balanced budget amendment, well, that was the 16th Amendment was sort of our undoing. The states used to be responsible for the federal debt. The states used to have to come up with the taxes before you had direct taxation of people. The federal government now just reaches right past the states and takes the money from the people. And that is what has allowed this crazy amount of spending. And then the Federal Reserve is the thing that facilitates this deficit spending. And just, while we're coming up on whether we raise the debt limit and by how much and what concessions we might get for raising the debt limit is already the balanced budget constraint in Congress. All of the balanced budget amendments that I've seen offered on the floor of the House have some sort of safety fuse that are loopholes big enough to drive a truck through. So, for instance, the one we passed a few years ago when we were in the majority said that if you had a 60-vote majority, that you could override the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution that they had proposed. Well, just that same week, or within a week of then, they passed. They raised the debt limit or passed an unbalanced budget with over 60 members of Congress. And in the Senate, it's already a requirement. So the balanced budget amendment, it kind of already exists. It's the debt limit, okay? And we're about to vote to undo the debt limit. So if you have a balanced budget amendment that allows Congress to vote to undo it, they're going to undo it. The other problem with the balanced budget amendments I've seen, I know we're running out of time, is they usually have an exemption for war. Well, the first thing Congress will do every 2 years is elect a speaker, adopt the rules package, and declare war on some unfortunate third world country so that they can engage in deficit spending if that's a loophole for the balanced budget amendment. So, I mean, I'm not necessarily against those things, but let's be smart. Let's recognize there are already constraints and Congress gets out of them. And if you put loopholes in a balanced budget amendment, Congress is going to use them just like they do right now to raise the debt limit.
So you'd rather see Congress have pass a clean repeal of the 16th and 17th Amendment and a clean repeal of the Federal Reserve Act versus, let's say, having a constitutional convention where we don't know what would come out of it, where people would be proposing like a balanced budget amendment and term limits, which wouldn't even fix the problem, essentially.
Absolutely. Repeal 1913. Just repeal everything that happened there because it all went hand in hand. Direct election of senators went with direct taxation of people. The senators quit representing the states that year, and the federal government could start ignoring the states because the senators weren't elected by the states, and the federal government didn't need revenue from the states to function anymore. It created its own source through the Federal Reserve, the printing of money, and also through the direct taxation of people. It was a severe blow to our republic.
I want to ask you one last question. I know we're really out of time, but the last question is simply this. Speaking of potentially repealing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, you've made a step towards that potentially with the introduction of your bill, H.R. 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. And I noticed that Congressman Eric Burleson and Jim Jordan and Brian Donalds have all signed on to it recently. Could you briefly just summarize the tenets of that bill and what you believe the full scope of the audit would be or should be, assuming it was to pass?
There's a lot to unpack here. I don't know how much time you have, but let me just sort of dip my toe in it. The Federal Reserve's never undergone a full audit. Now, you got two groups of people who oppose my bill. Those who say that it's already audited, and so they don't need an audit, and those who say if you audit it, then it'll change the way it behaves, that it needs to operate in secret, and the markets can't influence it, and Congress can't influence it, it can't be open to political pressure that an audit would expose. Well, both of those arguments can't be true. That they're already undergoing an audit is one argument, and the other argument is if you do audit it, it will change the nature and the way in which it works. They're just smoke screens is what they are. There's a perfunctory audit that doesn't really uncover the way they make decisions. And we need to know that. With all the authority that's vested in the Federal Reserve came from Congress. Like you can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. And we're still responsible for that. So we need to know what they're doing. Now, there's this other argument that they're independent. Give me a break. They may be independent of Congress, but they're not independent of the bankers in Wall Street. All of the heads of the Federal Reserve and the heads of their various banks, the regional banks, they come from industry and they're going to go back to industry. They come from banking and investment banking. They're going to go back into those industries, or they come from Treasury. And the Treasury and the Federal Reserve communicate every day. Every minute of every day, they are in constant communication. Don't tell me the Federal Reserve is independent of the executive branch. They're printing money and buying the debt off of each other. And you can't say that, oh, we're just going to print some money and lay it here on the street corner, and then maybe somebody will come and borrow it, and then we're not coordinating. Of course they coordinate every minute of every day. So Congress needs to get back in there. This is a gift to the executive branch. Basically we've given up our power to the executive branch, and and to industry, to the bankers. We need to reassert it. An audit would do that. And once you do the audit, you may find that you need to end it. And so I'm glad to have those co-sponsors. And this bill has passed. It's passed out of the Oversight Committee. Once when I was on the Oversight Committee and we got it to the floor, it even passed the floor of the House when Paul Brown was the sponsor. And the senators, they are, we just, occasionally some of my colleagues run for Senate, some of my colleagues in the House, and they get elected. And I have a few weeks to spend with them before they transition over in the Senate. And there was a recent one, I believe it's Peter Welch from Vermont, who I have great respect for. He's co-sponsored this bill. He was on the Oversight Committee with me, so it was significant that he co-sponsored it. We got it passed. I said, don't be one of those guys who sponsors this bill in the House and then gets to the Senate, wink, wink, nod, nod, not going to name names, Bernie Sanders maybe, who gets to the Senate and then doesn't vote for it and doesn't support it once they become a senator. And I'm picking on Welch at the moment, but there are other senators who've done that, who have given the same admonishment too. So we can get this out of the House. There are often Democrat sponsors for it. It passes with an overwhelming bipartisan majority. So the fact that we've only got 222 Republicans shouldn't be a problem. The problem's going to be in the Senate, where you have people who, once something happens in the water, 300 yards from here, they become senators and they don't sponsor this or vote for it anymore.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today. Thank you so much for your time. We know that you're really busy. And thank you for everything that you're doing in Congress to protect American liberties as well. Take care, Congressman Massie, and God bless you.
God bless you and your listeners, Christian. Thanks.
Thank you.
You remember when everyone bought all the toilet paper? And they wanted me to wear these things? And someone invested a lot of money into this stuff. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
Being informed is important, but being informed with the truth is essential. Visit thenewamerican.com for news you can trust.